Madame, Monsieur, bonjour, bienvenue ici au Club Suisse de la Presse, bienvenue en ligne exactement. Je suis absolument ravie de ce rendez-vous dédié à la COP28 et à cette nouvelle collaboration avec Geneva Solutions, sa rédactrice en chef Kasmira Jefford et son équipe de rédaction. Nous souhaitons avoir des rendez-vous qui deviendront réguliers, mensuels, dès l'an prochain et faire connaître, partager, relayer le travail fantastique qui est fait par l'équipe rédactionnelle de Geneva Solutions et son expertise. Good morning everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to you at the Geneva Press Club. It's a pleasure also to host the first talk of many more to come, organized with Geneva Solutions Media and its editor-in-chief, Kasmira Jefford. Our intention is to share and promote Geneva Solutions' work and expertise. Thank you, Kasmira. Qu'attendre de la COP28, la conférence de Dubaï sur les changements climatiques, 28e édition du rendez-vous international sur le climat sous l'égide de l'ONU commence ce jeudi 30 novembre. Quels en sont les enjeux principaux en termes de climat, bien sûr, mais aussi de santé, de droits humains, d'énergie fossile? Peut-on en attendre des progrès significatifs ou les COP ne sont-elles que des machines à greenwashing, comme on l'a souvent entendu? What is to expect of COP28? COP28 starts on Thursday. What are the main issues in terms of climate, of course, but also health, human rights, fossil fuels? Can we expect significant progress from this, or are COPs just greenwashing machines? Thank you, Kasmira, of course, but thank you also Michel Langrand and Paula Dupraz-Dobias from Geneva Solutions for being with us today. Thank you also to Elaine Fletcher, Editor-in-Chief of Health Policy Watch, and thank you also to our two experts of the day. Thank you, Matthew, Mike Kinnan, and thank you, Joy Chulhuri, and Kasmira. Kasmira, I leave you the floor right now. Thank you for this beautiful collaboration.
Right, hello everybody, and thank you for coming here today, and to those joining us online. We're going to do a really quick canter through some of the highlights we expect from this year's COP, which is on Thursday, as Isabelle just said, and three of our guests here will be heading there this week, so we've grabbed them before they go. And we've already had the introduction, so just to set the scene first, before we go into the science and some of the more contentious issues, well, actually starting with a contentious issue, this is quite an unusual COP because it's taking place in Dubai, which is a massive fossil fuel producing nation, and with a questionable human rights record, in particular over, this will concern our journalists here, restrictive laws over freedom of expression, and unusual in that its president is also chief executive of ADNOC, the UAE's state oil company, which revelations from the BBC this week kind of confirmed our fears about this conflict of interest, and that they may be or are allegedly using their discussions with countries to also talk about potential oil deals as well. So, I mean, that's to set the scene. So as journalists, I want to start with Paula. What's it like going into this as a journalist and covering COP? How does it compare to other summits that you've been to? And then I'll turn to Elaine to ask the same thing.
Well, I actually, this would be probably about the 9th or 10th COP that I've been to. Okay, now it works. Yeah, so this is probably about the 9th or 10th COP that I've been to, and it's always this massive affair that basically you have to be very, very organized going into the COP ahead of its start to be able to pinpoint exactly what it is that you're going to be covering. Aside from the negotiations, which are of course the reason for this COP, there's this huge loads and loads of side events conferences that many of the countries that are participating at the event also organize. So in addition to that, the events usually take place in huge spaces, so a lot of walking. It is, I guess, the place to be covering the climate conference. I mean, the negotiations. Of course, other reporting which I've done as well on the field is I think very impactful and very important. But this is really where you meet all sorts of people, from precisely the negotiators to the to NGOs to civil society groups and so forth. So really really interesting and very exciting to cover.
Yeah, Elaine, I mean, same question to you. This is you're our health expert writing for a specialist publication that focuses on health and health governance and health-related issues. And this is the first year, we'll be going into this in more detail later, but this is the first year that there's a dedicated health day. But how do you go about finding these stories to cover at COP, given the amount of events? And also for health, is it obvious which stories to do, given that in the past there hasn't been perhaps the focus that health should have at COP?
Yeah, I can remember attending COP in Paris in 2015, I think it was, when I was with the World Health Organization Climate and Health team, and they had a tiny booth about the size of this table or two of these tables. We did our best to push in with we had a big banner, a big poster that we put up illegally because there was no space, a 3D poster about climate and health. And we managed to have 2 side events, and there were a few ministers of health mainly from the SIDS, the Small Island Developing States countries. And compared to what now this year, WHO for the second time ever will have its own pavilion with running about 40 events. And last year's events at Sharm el-Sheikh, where I was actually really impressed with what they were doing. They really had a very big range of speakers talking about issues from fossil fuel phase out to electrification of health facilities with solar energy, which is a big issue in the developing world, actually, and a very neglected issue. About 1 billion people worldwide lack access to health facilities with adequate electricity or energy to function basic health devices, medical devices, and 450 million have access only to a health facility with no electricity whatsoever, and this has just never been on the agenda of anyone before. At the same time, there is a big fear. This is the first official health thematic day on the 3rd of December, and there are many fears, including among the global health community, that this could be used as a kind of, they call it greenwash or health wash, covering up an agenda that doesn't really make progress on the key issue, which is moving out of fossil fuels, reducing subsidies from fossil fuels, which I understand now hit an even bigger high. I think it was 7 trillion in 2020. I hope I got the years right. 2022 as compared to 2020. They actually went up, subsidies to fossil fuels during the pandemic. And this is basically subsidizing not only global warming, which causes tremendous heat-related and disease-related impacts, but also air pollution, which kills 7 million people a year. So the problem is, the dilemma faced is that the health issue is getting more lip service, but whether countries really care and are really translating that into action is still a big question mark. And I think that's where the nexus is this year.
Right, so well, thank you for that. We'll come back to those really important points in a minute. But first, before we turn to our 2 experts, Michelle, can you give us a bit of a breakdown where we are today on some of the many reports that came out in the last 2 weeks? We've had about 5 different UN reports. all pretty much pointing to the same thing, but get us up to speed on those before we then turn over to Matt. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I mean, of course, the discussions that are going to happen in Dubai are going to be political in nature, but the background is a very real climate crisis that we're living and that we're facing also in the future. A worse one if action doesn't take place. And before going into, I mean, I won't go through all the reports because, of course, that would be quite depressing. But before going into the latest ones, I'd like to remind also that we had sort of the Bible of climate reports that sort of ended their cycle this year, and it was the IPCC sixth cycle report. And some of the key findings that I think that we need to keep in mind as we go into COP28 is up until now, the world has already warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. It is unequivocally human action, human activities that are the main culprits of this global warming. And in some cases, the damage that it has done is irreversible, such as, for example, sea level rise. This means that no matter what we do, certain changes that we are going to face cannot be reversed. The IPCC reports also point to 3.5 billion people, that's almost half of humanity, that is living in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change. Now, turning to this year, I mean, this year has been quite one more wake-up call. It has been said that it is on track to be the warmest on record, and we have already seen briefly the 2 degrees Celsius being briefly breached just this month. Now, with all this doesn't mean that we're sort of taking the right course of action. The UNEP's emission gaps report, the UNFCCC has come out and said that climate plans are not on track, and actually emissions will peak by 2030, while IPCC has recommended that we have to cut emissions by 43% by 2023 if we are to keep this 1.5 goal alive. This is, as Elaine has mentioned, of course, plans to produce more fossil fuel are really not going on the right direction, and they will actually double the limit that they should have to cap warming at 1.5 by 2030. And just the last thing, I mean, when it comes to preparation to the climate impacts that we're going to be having, we are definitely underprepared and underfinanced. This is UNEP that has said it. Vulnerable countries need 10 to 18 times more money to be able to cope with the climate impacts than what the financial flows that are coming into. So that's sort of some of the more scary, unfortunately, figures that we have heard in the past few months.
Thank you, and and that's the short version. And turning to Matthew McKinnon, who is president of Geneva-based climate NGO Aroha and an advisor to the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is a partnership of countries most vulnerable to climate change. Can you give us, because one of the big talking points at this COP will be the global stocktake. This is the first ever one, and it will shape how the future national pledges that are put in place by countries. And so can you just give us a brief overview of what it is, why it's so important, and how this will shape discussions at COP, and the perspective of the countries that you represent? Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much, Kasmira, and good afternoon, pleased to be here. Look, the global stocktake, which the first one is happening now, this is like the performance review of the Paris Agreement. Is it working or is it not working? Because when this was negotiated in 2015, we had this 1.5 goal, but we knew that the NDCs, the emission commitments of countries that were presented at the Paris conference, amounted to more than 3 degrees. So countries had come, been willing to cut warming to something like 3 degrees at best, and they negotiated an agreement to say we're going to cut warming to 1.5. And there are other components of the agreement on finance that was been mentioned, both for emissions and for adaptation to developing countries, on loss and damage and other areas. And all of that falls within the scope of the stocktake because it's a performance review on the entire agreement. But I'll speak very briefly because I think we come back to loss and damage and things later on, maybe just on the 1.5 topic to give an example. As we've heard, and the UNFCCC just issued this NDC evaluation report showing that still today, I mean, it depends on how you count, but essentially the emission commitments are still hovering somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees. And the IPCC's very latest report, years and years of science, is telling us that at the best estimate, the world hits 1.5 degrees in the year 2030, right? So this is only a few years away, and the way the science of it works is that because CO2 has a warming effect that continues for up to 100 years, so even if we completely are carbon neutral in the year 2030, there will still be a warming effect. And the way that that's dealt with in models is that they assume that there is massive removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere from the middle of the century onward. So basically, we're already extremely overdrawn on the Paris Agreement's targets. There's only 6 or so years to go before we actually hit 1.5 degrees. And in the legal structure of the Paris Agreement, countries are supposed to come with new climate targets every 5 years. Those targets are supposed to be between 5 and 10 years in length. So the last time that countries were supposed to update their targets was the year 2020. Most of them didn't. It was during the pandemic. And finally, at Glasgow, the majority did finally come with new targets, which didn't, again, change the equation. So at Glasgow, there was a decision saying, okay, we cannot wait and wait. So we will call on countries that they must do their targets upgraded by the next time we meet, so in Sharm el-Sheikh. But when we met in Sharm el-Sheikh, countries were not updating their targets either. And we don't expect that many countries would present new targets either for this COP, even though Sharm ended with another decision saying, please urgently come and align your targets to 1.5. And the reason why countries are not doing that is because how do you tell if a country is aligned or not with 1.5? It's essentially left to countries to self-assess whether they are responsible or not. The Paris Agreement contains some very important provisions regarding equity, which says that you don't just look at how much you're polluting and draw a line to where you need to go. You need to actually also look at how much are you polluting per person, how much did you pollute in the past, and if you factor those things in, many wealthy countries like the United States should actually be already carbon neutral or for sure carbon neutral by 2030. And this is not factored in the decision making. When we do evaluations of how targets align with equity, we put out one called the traffic light assessment, which I would suggest you guys take a look at if you're interested. It gives a red, green, or orange light to every country in the world, depending on how they are aligned on the basis of equity to the Paris Agreement. In fact, most countries are aligned because you have developing countries that have polluted like 2 tons or less per person, and then you have some of the wealthiest countries like Australia. I'm from New Zealand originally, where they pollute 15, 20, 25 tons per person. So these countries need to have varied targets, and the responsibility needs to be taken. And one thing that the stocktake could do is try and concentrate the responsibility to close this massive gap, what is required in very little time, onto the countries who actually have the responsibility to do it. And there are different ways to close this gap. You could have a renewable energy target. You can have a target to phase out unabated fossil fuels, which is probably what they will agree to at this COP. But if ultimately this is a Paris Agreement, it's about governments taking responsibility, it is a legally binding agreement, and countries, if they step up and take responsibility, they can do so many things with regulations, with financing, in order to make sure that they do meet the targets. Interestingly enough, Switzerland is one of the few countries that has a green light among the rich countries, and it's because of the relatively little historical emissions and the effectiveness with which Switzerland has been cutting emissions compared to other wealthy countries.
Thanks very much. So we need to see polluting countries step up and take responsibility. That's the big question here. But also talking about responsibility, let's turn to finance, because this is arguably one of the biggest topics or elephants in the room at this year's COP. Who's going to pay for damages and losses to date? And I'm going to turn to Paula, who's been covering this issue a lot for Geneva Solutions. Could you tell us a little bit of what you've been reporting so far? And then we'll turn over to Joy. Thank you.
Well, if you don't mind, I'm just going to do a bit of a review on, as Matthew mentioned, I mean, finance is really central to the solutions to tackling this issue that we're facing. But that, like so many other issues at COP, it's taken a really long time to evolve from the realization of needs, what they mean, to articulate those means, to committing to those needs, committing to get to a commitment by developed countries. So it was actually in 2009 during the Copenhagen climate talks that developed countries committed to provide $100 billion a year until 2020 to developing countries. In 2020, until 2020, this goal had not been reached. In 2020, it was only $83 billion that they were allocating to developing countries, and in 2021, it's still past that target date. It was still only at just under $90 billion. So, while, as Matthew had referred to, while there are estimates on the level of finance needs that are multiples more to the 100 billion, UNFCCC has said that developing countries will need at least $6 trillion by 2030 to achieve their NDCs, their nationally determined commitments, or the pledges that they've made under the Paris Agreement. Also, just another wider issue is finance in general. I mean, UNCTAD before 2019, in 2019, before the pandemic, they were saying that development and climate goals in developing countries will need 2.5 trillion a year. So just now, in terms of the finance that we're looking at, it's basically these 100 billion. It's basically mitigation and adaptation finance. But where there's a lot of it's very uneven in the way that these are being allocated. When we're talking about, just to go back, when we're talking about adaptation, we're talking about things like making houses stronger to resist storms, drought-resistant seeds, building larger water retention basins for rainfall that may be variable. When it comes to mitigation, it's things like renewable energies, providing the means for technology to allow for electric vehicles and so forth. As I said, there's very little that's been going towards adaptation, especially with regard to the climate vulnerable countries. And I mean, we're talking about, in the case of the most vulnerable countries, we're talking about, not even $1 per person that's currently going to these countries.
And just as to interrupt, since we're also talking about some of our articles that we've written, you've actually been, you went to Puerto Rico after the hurricanes there a couple of years ago. So you've also reported on the front lines, you know, what happens 2 years on when countries have still not been able to pick themselves up on their feet after suffering the worst effects of climate change.
Exactly. I mean, I was actually for last year in Puerto Rico. You know, a few just actually during a hurricane, and then a few years after the Hurricane Maria, where you can see. I mean, this is of course different because within the U.S., so it's not exactly included in the same group. But you know, just getting a sense of that. But I've been in South America, in Peru. Reporting on flooding and mudslides and so forth. So, the just to get back to the issue of financing, there's when it comes to when we look back at the type of finance that these countries have been receiving, a lot of it has been in you know, sort of linked, you know, conditioned financing, and what countries are really asking for is that this financing be in the form of grants. You know, within the context of the climate finance, there was the Green Climate Fund that was set up a number of years ago, but of course they've only been able to manage a very, very little number, sort of in the tens of billions of climate finance. Another issue that I wanted to mention was the private sector, and just hold on a second. Where am I?
So this point about the private sector stepping up and actually helping to help plug this enormous gap that we need in terms of mitigation, adaptation, financing.
Sorry. So the goodness, where was I?
We saw a lot of pledges back at COP27, but still, I mean, one of the big issues is this risk issue for a lot of private sector. Or the argument they put forward is that there aren't the opportunities that they would need to be able to invest, knowing that they're going to be able to make some sort of return on that investment. But we know that this is not the right argument, that this can be resolved, that there are opportunities, and yet we're not seeing the private sector step up as we'd like to see it. But that's one of the focuses of COP.
But sorry. So regarding the private sector, there's been pressure for them to step up. I mean, there's the obviously quite reluctant towards green investment, which is perceived as potentially less profitable. There's been talk about potentially having more regulation in order to incentivize the private sector to act, to step up to the plate. There's the issue, of course, of blended finance, which there's been a lot of criticism, which is basically private sector financing, providing finance to de-risk some of these investments. But actually, with in absence of all this, there has been this move, which we've seen over many, many years from developing countries, particularly the most vulnerable, to press for a loss and damage fund, and that actually was achieved. There was an agreement last year in Egypt at the COP to provide to allow for this loss and damage fund to be created. Over this year, there have been discussions, in fact, including here in Geneva, at the same time that this private sector, sort of public-private sector event, the Building Bridges, was taking place. And finally in October, it was decided that this sort of last-minute decision that the the loss and damage fund could be housed at the World Bank, which is sort of left, like, it's a decision that's sort of left everybody unhappy, which I guess in a way is a good and bad thing for the talks.
Maybe I can turn to Joy here to maybe talk a little bit about why we're not very happy that, although there's some controversy around it being hosted at the World Bank. Yeah, so also that from what I understand, the talks, there hasn't much been agreed on yet as to who's going to actually contribute and how we're going to, who are going to be the beneficiaries and how they're going to benefit from the fund or draw from the fund. Could you take us through some of the ramifications of the recent talks from the transitional committee?
Sure, thank you. So last year when the fund was established, it was really a moment of hope, of, feeling the possibility of, potentially transformative change and all of that. And this came after 3 decades of struggle and demands from developing countries. So then you have this loss and damage fund. Over this last year, there's been 5 meetings of the Transitional Committee to kind of figure out, well, we have this fund, what does it look like, how do we operationalize it, what are the details? And one of the big fights was around where will it be housed, right? And the World Bank was, so the developing countries and civil society wanted an independent fund housed under the principles of the UN Convention on Climate Change, and developed countries, or the historic polluters, were really kind of pushing for the World Bank. And right now, in November, the compromise that was reached was there would be an interim arrangement where temporarily the fund would be housed at the World Bank. With the there is no clear exit strategy, but there are some conditions that attach, and there are some points at which this exit could happen. But there is a lot of anxiety from those who are affected the most by loss and damage, who contribute the least, right? And why is this? It's because, and there are a lot of technicalities that I'm not going to get into, but I'm happy to if you want. But overall, the World Bank is geared towards serving the interests of richer nations. That isn't just rhetoric. That is how we have seen the banks operate over decades. And then its business model is to provide loans instead of grants. We have this enormous loss and damage that countries are facing, right? Like CVF published a report where they talked about 1/5 of vulnerable economies' wealth being wiped off the table. You're seeing massive levels of loss and damage. And then when finance is provided, it's provided as loans, which just heightens the vulnerability of countries. So this is a really important point. And another one, which is very technical, so I'm not going to get into it, but the World Bank's kind of operating frameworks lack critical modalities that allow for direct access by communities, and this has been a big demand of many of the countries as well as civil society, and this will be difficult to achieve. There are some possibilities under the conditionalities that have been attached to this arrangement, this interim arrangement, but it is not clear because of these kind of lack of critical modalities. So that's the World Bank, and I'm happy to go back and go further into that.
And I should also say, because I didn't introduce you at the beginning, but Joy Chowdhury is Senior Attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law, SEAL here in Geneva. So I just wanted to add that to give some context as well. And you wrote an opinion piece for us, just published today, also talking about the evasion up until now of developed countries to kind of take responsibility, as Matt was saying, and also the fact that the Paris Agreement, developed countries have made sure that there is no liability, anything that ties them to being liable for, legally for any loss and damages. Could you, talk about that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, sure. And so I'll start with what's happening at COP28, since you're all here, and then I'm going to go a little bit into the direct question that you asked, which is also zooming out a little bit from the UNFCCC in Paris, but very briefly. So the big fight, as has always been the case, is who is responsible to pay up for these loss and damages. Who is responsible, if we want to use less kind of punitive terms, to provide financial resources to address these massive levels of loss and damage that we're seeing. And during these 5 meetings that we saw over the last year, we've just seen wealthy countries engage in, you know, delay and obstructionist, even bullying tactics, I would mention, to really kind of take out any kind of reference to responsibility of historic polluters to pay for loss and damage. These loss and damages are not just happening, right? They're being caused. We understand the drivers. And even then, even if, say, we take away the kind of who is responsible to pay, you know, in terms of liability and compensation, even in terms of international cooperation, in terms of like, you know, countries with more resources should show solidarity and pay up with all of that. And there is some voluntary pledges that will be there. But from the text, any kind of reference to responsibility was taken out, right? There is some level of differentiation that is now there in the text that has been sent to COP to be approved, but that was a really big fight. They took out the foundational principle of CBDR, which is common but differentiated responsibility, that is a founding principle of the UNFCCC. They took out any mention of liability and compensation, and to understand that we have to go back into the history of a little bit of the UNFCCC, and I promise I'll keep it brief. But the loss and damage, when we have it in the Paris Agreement, but in the decision that adopted the Paris Agreement, any reference to liability and compensation was taken out by the decision that adopted the Paris Agreement under this paragraph 51 thing. And countries often turn to this, right? But when harm is caused under law, right, and it can be attributed, then redress needs to be made. This is fundamental international law. And Paris and UNFCCC does not exclusively or exhaustively define states' obligations in relation to climate change. So that also needs to be taken into consideration. But I'll stop here.
Given this context, can we then, and the voluntary nature of countries actually committing to some of those pledges that that Matt touched upon, can we expect some tangible results and more than lip service at this year's COP? I mean, I'm skipping to our end question, but perhaps we need to just anchor it, because this is ultimately the question that we want to kind of answer, although we won't know until 2 weeks' time. Matt, do you want to also, with your hat on, I mean, what are you, could you also maybe just briefly say what you're hoping to achieve out there, why you're kind of going, and what results you'll be seeking?
Sure, thank you, Kas. Well, I'm still going in the capacity of supporting the Climate Vulnerable Countries group, which is the Climate Vulnerable Forum. But possibly for the last time in that capacity, because this forum is becoming an independent international organization, and there would be some announcements around that, I think, at the COP. But, I mean, the COP is the place where the entire international community can take a collective decision. That's the point of the COP. And these decisions are written in, you know, the paperwork that gets, you know, heavily negotiated, especially in the last hours that usually go 1 or 2 days over at the end. And then those decisions are the anchor of this whole process. What will happen next year? So somehow a COP is always a little bit behind. You agree something in Glasgow, you hope that it gets delivered on, you know, private finance commitments, are they actually happening? But then you have to wait to see, will this actually be followed up on? And you have the next COP to kind of check that the last COP's decisions were followed on. So, you know, it sounds like a complicated process, because it is. I mean, but we still have to go through it. So what are the kinds of things that could happen at this COP? We could have a decision to have a new global renewable energy target that would be very ambitious up to the year 2030, which would do a lot to accelerate the momentum behind renewable energy. We could have a target to eliminate or phase out fossil fuels, which I think would be tagged with this unabated wording, which means that you can still pollute if you capture the carbon from what you pollute, basically, which is what the oil producing in other countries will be looking for. I suspect we will have, the fund will actually be established, because last year it was really just the call to create the fund, and all the work was being done this year, so that decision should go ahead, and maybe there will be some pledges, but we have to be realistic that like UNFCCC funds are not big usually. Like you mentioned, the GCF, which is the biggest, is still tiny. It's in the few billions. Adaptation has a fund as well. It's delivered less than 100 million per year since it existed to the entirety of the world's developing countries to support them on adaptation. Unlike loss and damage, adaptation and mitigation is a formal legal commitment to provide that funding. That commitment to provide funding for loss and damage does not exist. It's been sought, but it has not been given. So there is no obligation to provide. So it will remain purely voluntary, and that won't change at this COP. There might be pledges, but the pledges are unlikely to take this fund ever beyond much that the adaptation fund currently is. That's why it's important to look at other measures, like what the IMF is now doing and the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, but a lot of those measures will have debt implications that could make situations for countries more tricky. And as we have inflation now, just having the IMF print money and give it out is not necessarily also going to help global economic stability, which will in the end also affect people. So, you know, all of that is very complicated. We hope that one of the outcomes will be that there can be a recognition that actually to close this gap. And closing this gap right now for 1.5 degrees is really significant. Health has been one of the topics here. Just to give you some context on what that means, we commissioned The Lancet last year to do a forward study of all their climate change and health research to date, which means they looked for the first time not at what the current climate change implication on health is, but what it would be in the future. One of the key conclusions was that if there is no real climate action by the end of this century, every single year, 3.5 million people will die of heat-related deaths, right? That's one statistic. Every single year. So this is similar to like alcohol or the biggest causes of death. 50% of those deaths would be avoided if we capped warming to 2 degrees. 90% of those deaths would be avoided if we kept warming to 1.5. And we have this tiny window. So, and legally, because of the 5-year system, in 2025, when countries are obligated to come back and update their emission targets, they will most likely just present new targets for 2035 that avoid having to change their 2030 targets. So if we really want to change the targets that will actually keep us in 1.5, it has to happen next year. And it would make sense to make use of this first ever global stocktake to direct the power of that stocktake onto the countries most responsible. And it's very, very simple to figure that out. It's literally, you take the population of a country and you divide their emissions and you figure out how much they polluted since 1990 or maybe 1950. It's very simple math. And the equation is also very simplistic in terms of which of the countries responsible. It's basically all the G20, with the exception of potentially the UK, who has a good target. How credible that target is, given that they now want to open up the North Sea again for oil and gas exploration, etc., who knows? But at least they have a target that is more or less consistent with their equitable obligation. That's not the case for the rest of the G20. So I think that could be one of the key things that could happen at this COP.
Thanks for that resume. So easy solutions on paper and theory, but a lot of politics that make that ultimately difficult to happen. Elaine, can we turn to you, because Matt touched on some of those frightening figures there, health
actually
figures. And that's just the heat-related deaths, not to mention other health implications.
Does one of these work? Is that working? Yeah, it's actually a larger number. The IPCC forecasts that with unabated, in the worst-case scenario, by the end of the century, we'll have 9 million deaths a year from climate-related heat, vector-borne disease, and malnutrition tax. And that's not counting the 7 million deaths a year, one of the largest burdens of disease, for a single risk factor that we count from air pollution. And as Matthew also mentioned, countries are sort of tending to try to push off their targets, but while they're pushing off the targets, not only are they increasing the risks of the heat-related deaths occurring, they're also delaying the reduction of deaths from air pollution. Because if you met the Paris Agreement goals, you would be reducing air pollution deaths as well by, I think, at least 1 million a year, if not more. And then also to mention, you can talk about deaths. I mean, 7 and 9, 16 million deaths a year is, I think it's probably there's about 40 million premature deaths or 60 million a year from all causes. It's a huge chunk of the global burden of disease, as they call it in the health technology, or the health lingo. But also we're talking about scenarios where if we don't hit this, if we don't keep to this 1.5, and if we exceed it, that, you're talking about 1/3 of the world's population living in areas that will be uninhabitable effectively by the end of the century. Because there's only a certain level at which basically you can't support human life unless you're in a bubble of some kind. In temperatures that are above an average temperature, I think it's 35 degrees, and there's all sorts of science around that. If it's high humidity, it has to be a lower temperature. If it's low humidity, then it can be a bit higher. But you basically can't sustain life. You can't work outdoors. So you're talking about huge amounts of migration and just, I think it was something like 1/3 of the terrestrial lands of the planet not being inhabitable by the end of the century. So it's just really catastrophic scenarios. What I wanted to bring up on the finance side was simply that the big elephant in the room to me, again, is the 7 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies, which I just checked the number. That was the number for 2022 from the IMF, as compared to 5 trillion a year in 2020. Basically, we're paying fossil fuel companies to kill us and to kill the planets. And all of the money we're talking about, the loss and damage, the adaptation fund, the green climate fund, all of these things could be funded. Plus, we talk about universal health coverage if we got rid of these subsidies. And I don't see personally enough talk. I know the number, okay, but I don't see enough talk among the finance people and in the media about who's subsidizing this. Some of these are consumption subsidies, some of these are government subsidies. I think everybody shares the blame on this, unlike the loss and damage, which is a legitimate issue. We have major countries in Africa, from Kenya to Nigeria to Ghana, and DRC laying massive plans for new fossil fuel exploration, stimulated by the US, North America, the Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians. So everybody's actually to blame on this one, I think. And it's the subsidies that I think need a lot more attention and repeated analysis and looking at who's doing it, how, what are they paying, to really address this effectively, to address the finance, because it's where the money flows, is where you're going to get solutions. And right now, the money's still flowing to fossil fuels, and we're paying them. We're being taxed to pay fossil fuel companies to do this.
I'm just gonna, I see Paula nodding her head and wanting to say something, and just at the same time, if you could also perhaps in your answer, do you think we'll see some kind of, what's the likelihood of having some kind of agreement on fossil fuel phase down or phase out, or subsidy and yeah. So if you could touch on that, or if anyone, and we'll start opening up to everyone on the panel. We're running out of time, so we're going to give quite short 1-minute answers.
So just quickly on fossil fuels. Obviously, we are in a country. The person presiding this conference is the CEO of an oil company, and he's typically it is the responsibility of the president to be able to bring together some sort of agreement. So. Given the news that we've had recently about these private deals that are going to be taking place between his company and other and partner and other countries, we have to see what's going to happen. But one issue that I just wanted to mention was, you were talking about living in a bubble, but there's also the issue of the voluntary carbon markets, and these offsets that are going to be also discussed. There's been a proposals that were presented in the last month, and one of the issues that are going to be debated is that of carbon removals. So I mean, a lot of countries have been using actually the offsetting their emissions, saying companies basically presenting these net zero plans to pretty much, in many cases, continue business as usual, yet saying that they're going to be achieving net zero by offsetting their emissions, somewhere far away. So that will also be another point to be looking out for. But yeah.
I just want to turn over to Michelle, because we've should come back to you. You haven't spoken since the beginning, and there are lots of other issues that we'll be focusing on at COP. You might want to talk about some others, but one is that there's going to be the biggest assembly of humanitarian aid organizations present at COP this year. Michelle, what's their role in this, and what do they hope? I mean, we don't have someone from one of these organizations here on the panel to ask. I'm asking you as someone who reports frequently on this topic. But what are they hoping to achieve there, and what influence can they have on discussions?
Yeah, just before getting to that, just regarding the discussions on famous Article 6 and carbon credit trading. Of course, these are discussions that are going to keep going during this COP. They need to sort of iron out some sticking points, agree on some basic rules to have sort of centralized or some sort of international system to be able to trade carbon credits. But this is going to raise a lot of questions, of course, of like what we've seen already on human rights violations, people getting thrown out of lands to protect forests in exchange, for money. And these are going to be issues that I imagine that civil society is going to be paying a lot of attention. It's not going to be the main priority, but I think that it's one of the issues that we need to be keeping an eye out on, because if a system is agreed on, so there was already an agreement in COP26, but if the details are really sorted out during this COP, we might see a system be launched as early as next year. Well, now turning to the humanitarian question, of course. So this is going to be the first time that there's going to be a day dedicated to. It's called Relief, Recovery, and Peace Day. Of course, it's I think like health. It's symbolic. It doesn't mean that it is officially on the negotiations agenda, but it does raise the profile of this issue. And I was mentioning earlier, the billions of people that live in conflict in highly vulnerable affected areas, and the IPCC was also recognized for the first time. I don't know if it was this year or last year, but that there is a link between climate change and humanitarian crisis. Climate change is causing more humanitarian crisis, or contributing to further humanitarian crisis. So during this day, I mean, as I said, it's going to be symbolic, but we've already seen reporting by the New Humanitarian that a declaration is going to be adopted that recognizes the link between conflict, and climate change, and calling for countries to sort of for money basically to also be streamed towards conflict affected places. So it's gonna be non-binding, of course, this declaration, but it puts this on the map the issue of conflict and a humanitarian crisis. Yeah.
There's so much to cover, and we want to give some time for a couple of questions. But I think one thing I also wanted to, I think everyone's aware of, but two big countries won't be there, well, their presidents won't be there, the US and China. How much can we get done without the leaders of some of these major nations here? And it's just an interjection, maybe someone wants to comment on that. But before we turn over for questions, could everyone perhaps give a final minute on what progress we can expect? I mean, Matt, you've kind of given a really nice summary just there, but perhaps if you have anything else to add, and then turning to everyone else on the panel, perhaps starting with Joy, what are the key things you're going to be looking out for, and what progress we can expect?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to touch on the issue of fossil fuels because it's very connected to loss and damage. If we don't figure out a way to turn off the fossil fuel tap in, equitable ways, as is feasible, but if we don't manage that, the kind of losses and damages we will see, all of the money in the world cannot cover. So it is absolutely critical at this COP that countries do whatever they can to get there. And obviously it's hard when the chief is making oil deals on the side and you have over 700 fossil fuel lobbyists headed to COP. It is very concerning, but every fraction of warming matters. Everything we can do in terms of keeping up the fight, and many countries, not just civil society, many countries are really trying to make progress on this. So the role of media is critical in monitoring and reporting out and calling countries to account on this. And on loss and damage, as Matt said, there will be pledges made. I think the EU, Denmark, and UAE is poised to make pledges. The decision that went from the Transitional Committee will be adopted likely on the first day of COP itself, and then countries on the second and third day itself during the high-level plenaries are expected to make pledges. All of the pledges will unlikely meet the scale of finance that is needed. It is still very important. Every bit matters, given the scale of suffering that is now there in the world. But we need to also look at how do we secure the strongest possible redress within the UNFCCC, and also, as Matt mentioned, outside of the UNFCCC. So I'll stop here.
Thank you. And Elaine, I mean, what do you think? Sorry, or Matt, if you want to go first.
I'll just go very quick because I kind of summed up. But I think it's important, because we're in Geneva, to make the linkages between what goes on in here. Some of you may follow the Human Rights Council or the different human rights bodies. There are interlinkages. Germany, for instance, came up for its Universal Periodic Review. There were a number of comments to Germany that the climate target was not aligned with the Paris Agreement. And as countries continue to go into breach with the Paris Agreement as we move forward, if that's the case, if there's no progress, then I think those responsibilities will accumulate more rapidly than maybe they have taken into account. So following this from Geneva as well is important, because that will have a ramification. I think that's something worth bearing in mind. And just another point on the Article 6, because Article 6 already functions in a way country to country. Switzerland has been involved in Article 6 for like Ghana, for example. The whole confidence in the idea of offsetting has completely collapsed this year. That's been one development that happened really this year. It looks like you can write off a very significant proportion of all the carbon offsets that were ever marketed to date under the voluntary market, for example. Like maybe 50, 60, 70, or even 80% might not actually represent real reductions, which is quite scary. But there's one other thing to bear in mind. If the responsible countries are actually supposed to do their real effort, they may find themselves, like the US, in a situation where they simply cannot do that anymore domestically at home. And we helped last year Sri Lanka to develop a long-term climate strategy that has been submitted to the UNFCCC. They have a huge resource of wind energy off the coast between Sri Lanka and India that could well exceed the demands of Sri Lanka and contribute to Indian energy supply renewable, which would technically make them, if they developed at all, by the early 2040s, a carbon neutral country, which is outlined in their strategy. So there is a way in which those equitable obligations could be transformed into additional financial support to help countries that have resources available to them to actually even become carbon negative very soon. And that's something that can also be supported under Article 6, which is quite interesting. And the lack of leadership is very concerning. The missing 2 key countries is a problem.
Yeah, Elaine, I mean, recapping the same question, but what do you think are going to be some of your main headlines for Health Policy Watch coming out of this? Scott, not that you have a crystal ball, but...
There'll be unprecedented visibility of the health issues, but really integrating health impacts, which can be quantified into the bargains that are struck, the finance, the accounting mechanisms, is very far off. It's not part of the formal negotiating track. It should be, I think. That would change the balance a lot. Again, I would also say on the subsidies, that issue needs to be linked closely, much more closely to the finance, the mitigation, and to the, and also to the health impacts of those same subsidies. And that, I just don't see that dialogue occurring. We talk about fossil fuel phase out, but again, I will repeat, I don't see much discussion of who's subsidizing the fossil fuels, what countries, where, how. You know, much more articulation of that needs to happen in order for people to wake up and realize that they're paying to create a crooked playing field. The playing field for, the incentives don't exist for green energy because the playing field isn't level.
Over to you, Paula.
Yeah, well, first of all, I wanted to make a point about the reporting, which, you know, as you mentioned in the beginning, over all the past years of covering COP, I always like to be able to go out and sort of be able to access people and do a sort of story about, or a story or two about what's going on in the place where these COPs are taking place. We've received, for the press that's been registered at the COP, we've received multiple reminders of registering photo equipment and where we might take photos and things like that. And already last year it was a very bizarre environment for reporting. I wanted to do some reporting outside and it just was very, very complicated. But yes, you know, I think that, you know, what, in spite of those limitations, I think that, you know, when it comes to my reporting, what I've always felt in any reporting is that one really needs to listen to the people who are most affected. And, you know, fortunately at these events, there is the ability to speak to those people. I've done in the past quite a bit of coverage, not only from COPs, but from the Amazon on the situation of indigenous people. There's usually a large representation of them at the COPs. But yeah, I mean, I think that they're just, there's so many issues. It's, we, hopefully there will be an ability, I mean, the negotiators will be listening to those voices within their own countries, as well as, you know, again, in the most vulnerable countries and populations to be able to achieve the result that we're hoping for.
Thank you. And last but not least, Michelle, I mean, you reported from COP in Glasgow. This time you'll be here, but there's a lot. I mean, at Geneva Solutions, we're always trying to make this link between the organizations, the ecosystem, international Geneva ecosystem here, with some of these wider global topics and discussions taking place at COP. And like Matt said, there's a lot going on in Geneva that's linked. That was a long ramble, but what will you be looking to cover over the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, well, Matt brought it up. I mean, the Geneva is where the human rights system is, and human rights, of course, are not part of the discussion, but they're always sort of underpinning discussions. Civil society is always pushing for language to be included in negotiations, in decisions, in declarations. So that's one of the things I think I'm going to be following, is to see how much this language actually makes it to the most important documents, and it's what will allow afterwards, after COP and all the media hype has died down, to see how that trickles down, maybe in Geneva, for example, the Human Rights Council, but also the committees that we've, the human rights treaties, we've also seen the committees come out with really important decisions and statements about, the climate and human rights link. So yeah, despite pushback, we have seen that in Geneva there has been sort of an increasing recognition that these two cannot be separated, climate change and human rights. So yeah, that's going to be sort of one of the things I'll be following.
Thank you very much. And I don't think we started about 15 minutes late, so not too over, but wanted to open up the floor to any questions that people in the room might have or online. Yes. And if you could give us your name and who you'd like the question to answer.
Check whether it's on. Yeah, okay. So my name is Umesh Palvankar. I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Center for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue, which is a small independent think tank, human rights think tank and advocacy institution created about 10 years ago, based across the street a little on. Okay, I think I can jump upon, this is just an observation come question, and I'll put the question at the end because they are interlinked. I jump upon some of the things that were said just at the end by the lady speaker, the panelist at the end, and I think his name is Matthew, a little earlier. What can we take away from COP28? So I heard a lot about, and this is absolutely crucial, I mean, the 1.5. If we can't lessen the emissions, the whole thing collapses. We are all agree, and it affects all of us. That's one. The second is, I heard a lot about loss and compensation, loss and damage. Of course, this has to happen because otherwise the most polluting and the least polluting, there's a complete imbalance. And third is also about climate finance. We heard about IMF, etc., World Bank. Now, my question, this is the observation or the question linked to it. What can we take from COP28? If these are the main issues, that's why I come to the last panelist, because that was in my question in my mind already before he spoke. What about the human rights perspective? The recently recognized both by the HRC last year and General Assembly, the right to a clean, safe and healthy environment. I mean, where do we stand with state accountability? Under public international law, states are accountable for international law violations that their entities or they themselves might commit. So, come back to what the gentleman, if I remember Matthew's name, if I can see, said, depending upon the degrees in which global warming goes up, so many million will die, so much degrees. All right, but these people who die, what about their human rights? The right to, why was this right adopted? We all know that UNGA resolutions are not legally binding, but they can turn into customary law over time, naturally. But how do we? So that's basically my question. I would like simply to end by saying that there is a glimmer of hope in Switzerland. A few weeks ago, recently, there were some elderly ladies who led a march to Bern and say Switzerland's use of fossil fuel is violating our this particular right to a healthy, clean and sustainable environment. Federal court threw it out. European court accepted it. Secondly, in Montana, young people went, court accepted it, and Turk appreciated the decision. And finally, I think there is a advisory opinion asked of the ICJ on state accountability with regard to violations of the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So where do we stand with COP28? Thank you.
Thank you for those important comments. This is something that actually Michelle's reported much about. Perhaps you'd like to make a comment to his comment?
Yeah, well, I'll leave the ICJ maybe to Joy because that's more her expertise. What I can say about what of human rights it's sort of the big question because it's always sort of, there's a lot of pushback. It's been recent that those that have been proponents of recognizing the link between human rights and climate change, and also, of course, just in general, environmental degradation it's just recent that they have sort of won that battle. We've seen that here in Geneva, and that's sort of, of course, a lot of the mechanisms and debates that happen here in Geneva that don't necessarily imply, binding measures. It has sort of helped to gather momentum and help civil society to push for these discussions in their own countries. For example, one of the things that I think will be important, and it will be the green transition, and we're already seeing that it has, if it's done badly, it has really catastrophic consequences, and it could even worsen the environmental, situation for a lot of communities. So it, again, I don't have the answer. I hope that the human rights question will be raised by civil society and by certain countries that are sort of leading on this issue. Now, the question is, will that sort of have an impact? I think it's too soon to tell. We'll have to see first of all, how COP28 ends, and what happens afterwards, how this discussion is continued afterwards.
I think we'll close it there because we've run out of time, and we've lost one of our speakers, Elaine Fletcher, but you can follow her work on the website of Health Policy Watch. I'd like to say a big thank you to our guests, Joy Chowdhury and Matthew McKinnon. You can follow SEAL's work as well. I know you tweet, your organization tweets quite prolifically, so you can follow updates from COP on their Twitter handle, which I think is just @CIEL. Also, Matthew, check out the Climate Vulnerable Forum's traffic light report, but perhaps you'd like to add...
So if I can just do a shameless shout out for our campaign, which is Fair Share Now. It's calling for countries to take responsibility to do their fair share following this global stocktake. So, thanks.
Thank you, and of course you can follow our work on our website, genevasolutions.news, and we also have a daily newsletter that you can also sign up to on our website. Thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you at our upcoming events. Bye-bye.